Soon after the Beatles dissolved in 1969, one of the four members, John Lennon, left his native England and moved to New York City. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, took up residence in the Dakota, which is a very famous building that typically houses the rich and famous people of New York. As soon as Lennon moved to New York, he said that he felt relieved because he didn't have to worry about going outside and getting mobbed by a massive crowd of people that were obsessed with the Beatles. There were people that were huge Beatles fans in New York, but they seemed more respectful, and they would ask for his autograph, but they would mostly leave him alone. Mark David Chapman had always been a massive fan of the Beatles with a particular interest in John Lennon. But after a 1966 interview where John Lennon kind of off the cuff said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, this soured Chapman's adoration of Lennon. One of Chapman's high school friends recalls around this time frame Chapman rewriting the song Imagine by John Lennon to read Imagine if John Lennon was dead. Chapman started referring to Lennon as a poser and said that he espoused virtues and ideals that he himself did not practice. And so in relative short order, following that 1966 interview, Chapman went from this adoring fan of the Beatles and John Lennon to really solely hating John Lennon and everything he stood for. By 1980, it's safe to say Mark Chapman had become obsessed with John Lennon. Specifically, he had become obsessed with hating John Lennon. In October of 1980, Chapman quits his job as a security guard and flies to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in the city and didn't really do much of anything. He would just periodically walk past the Dakota where John Lennon supposedly was living, but beyond that, he really didn't do anything in the city. But that would all change on December 8th, 1980. On that day, Chapman went to the Dakota, and he stood right outside the entrance to this building and just waited in hopes that he might run into John Lennon. At 5 p.m. that day, John Lennon comes out with his wife, Yoko Ono, and they walk right past Mark Chapman, who flags them down, and he asks John if he can have his autograph. And John Lennon, even though he has a limousine waiting for him, and there's people that are starting to notice that, oh, that's John Lennon, people are coming over, John still took the time to sign an autograph for Mark Chapman. He was very friendly with Mark and asked him if this is enough, do you want anything else? And Mark said, no, that's it, that's fine. And John Lennon said, okay, take care, and John and his wife Yoko Ono turned and went into the limousine and they drove away. When the couple got back to the Dakota that night, Mark Chapman had not left. John Lennon and Yoko Ono get out of their vehicle and they walk past Mark Chapman, who's standing right outside the front door. It's unclear if Mark and John had any interaction, but as soon as they passed Mark and were making their way into the building, Mark Chapman drew a gun and shot John Lennon 4 times in the back. And John Lennon staggers into the lobby screaming, I'm shot, before collapsing and dying. And Mark Chapman, he knew what he was doing, he just stood there, put the gun back in his pocket and just waited to be arrested. Chapman's lawyers wanted him to plead insanity, but he refused and instead said, I was totally sane, I knew what I was doing, I chose to shoot John Lennon, and I plead guilty. And he was given 20 years to life in jail. And while he was in jail, he would admit that the only reason he did that was to become famous. That was it. This is the picture of Mark Chapman getting that autograph from John Lennon in front of the Dakota just hours before he would gun him down. He's still in jail today, and he actually just had his 11th parole hearing last month in August of 2020, and it was denied.